think many of you already know Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Coimbra, as well as a distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But he is also the director emeritus of the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. His pioneering work in investigating and highlighting the subtleties and novelties of epistemologies of the South and decentralizing the epistemic colonialism that had a hegemonious rule over thought for many years, um, is inspiring and is also connected to the talk he will be giving today about possible measures in post-pandemic times inspired by epistemologies of the South. And I believe this is also closely related to one of his newest books, exploring futures from a post-pandemic perspective and tied in with epistemologies of the South. In this book, you say you try to translate somehow the current crisis of the virus, the agency of the virus, and present a memory of the future, which I found really interesting. And I'm really curious to see how epistemologies of the South can contribute to this debate. So I give you the stage. Looking forward to hear.
Okay, Razan, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with all our uh, participants to discuss something that is really of my very close interest at this point. And I think that what I'd like to share with you is the extent to which this epistemological proposal I've been putting forward may be of interest now at these pandemic times in which we are living. And I will start by three preliminary notes. The first one is that in that book that you mentioned, it will be soon published in English, the future begins now from the pandemic to utopia. It will be published by Routledge. What I'm saying is that in fact the 21st century is beginning with this pandemic. We have already a major crisis in this century, from the 9/11 to the global financial crisis. But I think that this one is different because I think that usually the centuries begin by some event that transforms the life in the decades to come. Like, for instance, the Industrial Revolution, which is, marks the beginning of the 19th century, which was 1830s, and the First World War and the Russian Revolution mark the beginning of the 20th century. Why? Because in fact they changed many of our social political life for decades to come. And I think the same will happen with this pandemic, because I don't think that we'll get rid of the pandemic so soon. I think we are entering a period which I've been calling the intermittent pandemics. That is to say, the virus will come and will go, and there will be mutations. But in fact, if we take seriously all the studies that have been put forward on the climate change, the global warming, we know that our model of development is really creating new occasions for virus, because we destabilize the vital cycles of life of the animals, the wild animals, and as you destabilize them, sometimes the virus that circulate among them and are very precious for life in the planet, all of a sudden they come to humans, and humans are not prepared to that. So I think that we are entering a period in which we are going to have more pandemic. Of course, we'll we'll learn how to live with that, but there will be always major crises. Look at now the insecurity about the vaccines, for instance, and the efficacy of the vaccine. So I think that the first note is that the century is beginning with this pandemic because it will be with us. So the second one is that this pandemic is a sign of an immense fragility of humankind. So to say, the most developed country in the world, the United States, um, you know, got lost when it got invaded. And in fact, the United States have been used to invade other countries, but all of a sudden they were invaded by a virus. And they didn't know what to do. And in fact, it is one of the countries with the highest mortality rates of this virus. So this shows immense fragility, but this fragility occurs on the eve of the announcement of a brilliant demonstration of the potentiality, the technological hubris of humankind, which is the fourth industrial revolution and the artificial intelligence, in which we are thinking that we are capable of mastering nature and technology to an extent that wasn't unheard of before. So there is this mixed images of fragility and strength, and they collide. And there is no common picture for these two. The third note is that this pandemic occurs inside of a global pandemic in which we have been in for the past 40 years. Is the pandemic that there is no alternative to capitalism. There is no alternative to this kind of society, this model of development, of production and consumption. There were alternatives in the past, but in fact, they have been neoliberalism is telling us that, uh, that's the end of history. That's Fukuyama's book. So the end of history, and therefore there is no alternative. So this is a pandemic because I think in politics and the human life, because we aspire to the infinite all the time, we are finite, but we have this capacity of imagining the infinite things. We need alternatives. And without alternatives, there is no politics. In fact, there is no human life, in my view. So this is also a note that this pandemic is creating a kind of a level of anxiety, raising it that, in a sense, 100 years ago, Freud saw very well in the discontent, civilization and its discontents. It was really almost 1 century ago. So, having said that, what can we say about, from the perspectives of the South, about this pandemic? I mean, I have written extensively on this pandemic, basic on the epistemology of the South. Basically, they are an attempt to identify and validate knowledge born in struggle against domination, be it capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Science, modern science, has also been used to fight against domination, and to that extent, it has a place in the epistemology of the South. So there is nothing anti-science in the epistemology of the South. The only idea is that science is a valid system of knowledge, but is not the only one. There are other systems of knowledge, and the popular knowledge, the peasants' knowledge, the indigenous knowledges, many other forms of knowing and ways of knowing that, in fact, we have been discrediting all along. And our universities, we usually deal exclusively with science, and therefore with one of the systems, which I think is precious and it's very important. But as I always say, if I want to go to the moon, I need scientific knowledge. But if I want to know the biodiversity of the Amazonian rainforest, I need indigenous knowledge. So I need different knowledges for different objectives in society. Well, these knowledges have not been, validated in our modern times. They have been suppressed, silenced, and they have been object of what I call the epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge. We have destroyed lots of knowledge all these 4 or 5 centuries since colonial expansion started. So what can we learn from a new epistemology that would try to bring together science with other ways of knowing, um, building what I call an ecology of knowledges. What could we learn from that? Well, in a sense, is to see, visualize the pandemic from below. And what we will see, but first of all, what we see is that beyond this pandemic, the general pandemic of the lack of alternatives, the popular classes, the most oppressed people by racism, sexism, and of savage capitalism, these peoples around the world, those that cannot be with us here because they don't have computers and they cannot afford teleworking and all these kinds of things, these people have, are suffering the pandemic on top of many other pandemics. The pandemic of hunger, the pandemic of lack of potable water, the pandemic of police brutality, the pandemic of domestic violence, the pandemic of expulsion from ancestral territories, the pandemic of land grabbing and the destruction of their territories. So there are many pandemics that they have been suffering. The other day, I was in a live transmission with the people in Antioquia, in Colombia, that are victims of a huge mega project, a dam that destroy the ecosystem of the rivers and has contaminated all the water, and there is no water actually now, and the fishes are gone. So all these are pandemics for these people because they have no alternative when they are hit by them. So they are suffering this pandemic on top of the other pandemics, and they have been selectively targeted by it. The virus is chaotic, but is not democratic because it's very selective in its mortality potential. We know that the highest rates of mortality goes for the poor, the black people in the United States, the people in the squatter settlements in Brazil, usually are people, bodies that are racialized, sexualized, that have been selectively targeted by this virus. Women, for instance, in the study, in this book that I published, I mentioned, a comparison of not only the incidence of mortality in two neighborhoods in the same city, São Paulo. One is an incidence 2 of mortality, the other is 60. So you can imagine the difference between the mortality rates in a radius of 10 kilometers. So it's really tragic. But you can also see the domestic violence, feminicide increased tremendously, and the domestic violence with the pandemic. So these people that are already suffering of some pandemic, social pandemics, all of a sudden are selected to be even more hit by the pandemic. So that's one of the lessons that I think that we should pay attention is that the vulnerabilization of the people in the world is very selective, and therefore there are lots of people that are suffering much more than others. And when we look at the vaccines and the geopolitics of vaccines, shows that for capitalism, any crisis is business. The CNN now, the financial commentators say that the new liquid gold is not oil anymore, are the vaccines, because they know that they are going to need we are going to need vaccines on a seasonal basis forever, so to say. And patents should be set aside by the World Economic Organization, Trade Organization, but they have not. Without setting aside the patents, we know that Africa will be left out of the vaccination until 2024 at least. That means that we are not safe in the world, because for of us that travel a lot, we know that there is no security, health security, if the world population is not vaccinated or with an immune system. So I think that system in which we are is becoming more and more unjust, and I think that we should see the consequences of this. So I think this is the dark side, so to say, the negative side of this. But in my work, I always try to bring the other side, the side of hope, the side of transformation, what I call the sociology of emergencies, what is coming out. And what is coming out is very interesting. And in this book, in one of the chapters, I do some research and I report it there on the creativity of abandoned communities. Many communities, popular communities, were abandoned by the state. The state was not there. They have been told for the last 40 years that the markets are the good regulator of social relations. The pandemic came and the markets were not there to protect them. So they resort to the state. But the state was not there anymore in many countries because they have been privatizing health systems. They have been underfunded. The health system has been underfunded. I've been claiming in Portugal that our health system, which is reasonably good on a comparative basis, was much better 10 years ago than it is now because of this private-public type of health as a public good and health as business. So I think that when we look at the community organization, it's amazing how many communities have been able to protect themselves, to create organization, internal organization against the fake news. I bring some case studies, like in Brazil, they were producing fake news about the virus, the government actually, and the people confronted that by creating communication systems inside the squatter settlements. And they organized their own lives. The landless movement, which is an important social movement in the continent, organized the distribution of tons of food, vegetables and other foodstuffs to the people. So solidarity, not solidarity between the rich and the poor. I haven't seen any, but I have seen much solidarity between among the poor to poor, and or impoverished. I never use the concept of poor because it's not a sociological concept. People are not poor; they are impoverished by the system. So I think that this solidarity is immense. We don't pay very much attention on the news because we see the news always are the scientists. It's better than the economists. Usually our news media were about the economists telling us about the economy. Now are the virologists, infectiologists, and biologists. Fine. I like that. It's much better. But they don't report that there are many other ways of knowing, and that, for instance, the indigenous communities and peasants communities were really reinforcing their traditional medicine for immunity. They have no vaccine, they don't solve, they don't have antibiotics, but they have very good medicines to improve the immunity of of the bodies. And they are fabulous experiments on this. In Cauca, in Colombia, in Madagascar, in other countries in Africa. And this is also very interesting because it's what I call an ecology of knowledge, of medical knowledge, so to say. So these are the novelties. And the third topic, which there are immense I can go into of these innovations in communities, which in my view are very interesting. What I think is striking is some ideas that have been very prevalent among the popular classes, among the marginalized communities. They were marginalized futures, the way they conceived of the future. All of a sudden, they are brought to the center. Why? Uh, I can give you several examples. The first one is the concept of nature. I've been in my intercultural studies, I've been working with indigenous people in different continents, in New Zealand and in Latin America, and also in Canada. And we know their concepts of nature as Mother Earth. that is to say, nature is not natural resource, is the center of life, uh, with a very opposed position to the one that we have established in the modern Western thinking and modern science. For us, nature belongs to us. For them, we belong to nature. And I think this is a completely different paradigm of relations between society and nature. Well, these conceptions, which in fact we had in the beginning in the 17th century with Spinoza, with the concept of natura, naturans, but what's set aside because we became all of us Cartesians, and all the rest of the world was not Cartesian, but just European knowledge. So these ways of thinking of nature as our Mother Earth, which have been part of the indigenous and peasant philosophies, all of a sudden are becoming much more central to us because we look at the United Nations studies, and what they say is that if we continue to destroy nature, global warming and the ecological crisis will reach a point in which probably human life will not be possible in the world. And we know that human life is 0.01% of the life in the planet. And we have been very arrogant. We are a tiny minority of the life in the planet, but we have been destroying it. So I think that we are paying a price for that. And in fact, the virus is a messenger, probably sent by nature to tell us, stop. If you don't stop, you are going to endanger the human survival in the planet. And when we see that the humans are already uh, uh, looking for Mars and for the moon and for many others, it looks like a dystopian, but probably a probability if life on Earth becomes unlivable. So I think that we have lots of new ideas that are coming for these marginalized communities. The other one is the concept of the countryside. We have in our system, we have always equated the city with progress and the countryside with, retrogressive type of ideas and underdeveloped ideas and things like that. Why do we go to the countryside to protect ourselves? Why Boccaccio went to the countryside of Firenze to Florence to write the Decameron to protect himself? His parents could not protect themselves, so they died in the city. So after all, is the countryside underdeveloped if we really are trying to protect ourselves from the virus in the countryside, in rural areas? Well, I think we have to change our conception of the rural and urban. The cities in which I've been working in Latin America are the most hit by the pandemic, be it Mexico City or Mumbai or Sao Paulo, because they are unbearable. In a sense, the public transportation makes it very, very dangerous. They are zones of high risk. So I think that we have to have a different urban planning, a different territorial planning in the future, and probably the countryside should be fully equipped so that more people should stay there and not come to the village, to the city. We see here in Portugal that the kids in the school system in some villages and interland, they don't have internet. So how can they go to school, teleschool, if they don't have internet or reasonable, reliable internet? So I think that we have to change that. Another idea about the possibilities is that we have been also only the social movements, peasants particularly, have been claiming against industrial agriculture that we need food sovereignty because we should produce our own products, healthy products, agricultural products. Well, to protect, family agriculture against the big industrial agriculture, which is the only one that in fact is protected in Europe or elsewhere. Well, what Now I see with some surprise is that World Bank documents, United Nations documents are talking about food sovereignty. Why? Well, because some countries are not sovereign. They depend on the import of foodstuffs. All of a sudden comes a pandemic and the borders are closed. It happened in Mozambique. Mozambique, for instance, is very dependent on South Africa. South Africa closes the border. And all of a sudden, for Mozambique, for a couple of weeks, was very secure as foodstuffs are concerned. And foodstuffs are essential goods. So I think that we have different conceptions of production that we have to bring to light. And I think that looking at the other side of or the other side of the line, as I call it, knowledge that they've been marginalized, they've been suppressed, they are not residues of the past. They are seeds of the future. Because I think that I don't want to become an indigenous person. I don't want to become peasant. But there is some kind of idea, some wisdom there that I would really like to have, not just as a person, but in society as such. So I think that we have the opportunity for intercultural learning is now there. If you ask me, but do you see that there? Well, it's really a terrain of dispute at this point because there are the negationists. Negationism is one of the in that book I um, bring forward three scenarios, possible scenarios for the crisis. One is the negationism. We see that in the United States, in Brazil, in India, and many other places. Then we see a possibility that something has to change, but nothing essentially will change. I call that gatto pardo because of the novel by De Lampedusa that we have to make some changes so that gives the idea that we are moving and changing, but in fact we are not changing anything. I think Europe is that. We are trying to do some changes, but nothing will be changed in our, for instance, in our consumption habits. Why do we live in societies of planned obsolescence? I mean, my computer here, your computer, your headphones, my cell phone could last for 20 years or 10 years. Why do they last for two? Because it is necessary to get back to the market. So I think that we have to change our notions of consumption, of consumption. So this will take time. So in my research, what I ended at the final note is that it may look like an utopian type of thinking. And I think we need utopia. We need utopia. I don't apologize for that. But I know, and I've been writing extensively about what I call real utopias. What are the real utopias? Are the innovations that we should really credit and validate and expand that are already there. So you should start a transition based on the more consensual things. For instance, we have certain consensus about the energetic matrix of the world, particularly Europe. Europe is very concerned about the change in this energetic grid and matrix. Yes, that's right. We should move much faster than that. But then there are many other things that we should be changing. The obsolescence, many people today are becoming a bit discomfort with this obsolescent type of consumption and many other areas. People just are looking for healthy, good stuffs that usually are produced by familiar agriculture that probably may be more expensive, but they are more nutritious and they don't have poison in them as the industrial agriculture products with insecticides, pesticides. We know I'm very involved in the movement against agrotoxic waste, agrotoxics in agricultural foodstuffs. And you can see there that there is, that's why my plea for ecology of knowledge is because in the movement you have scientists, biologists, engineers, biochemists, and we have the peasants and indigenous people that have the same conception of healthy food. So I think that we have to go on in this direction. I think that the epistemology of the South may help us to bring in a bit more cognitive justice, as I call it, justice among knowledge. Don't discredit the knowledge of the peasants, of the indigenous, so, well, this is superstitious, this is the past. No, there are alternative ways of knowing. We have to criticize them in many respects, as they criticized our ways, but we can learn through intercultural translation, a key concept in my work, particularly in my most recent book on this, The End of the Cognitive Empire, which was published by Duke University in 2018. I tried to make this point very strong on intercultural translation, which in my view is the alternative to war. And I see the world going more into war than into intercultural translation. But that's the option, and I think we should struggle for peace. And peace, in my view, is not achievable without a bit more of cognitive justice in our world. Thank you.